different frame. I'm your co-host, Anisha.
And I'm Kendra.
And this is a podcast for the people, by the people. Now, the show is made possible by Alabama Values Progress, a media advocacy organization that is dedicated to breaking the cycle of misinformation during the times where the truth is pretty much hard to find. We're out here delivering facts, data, and receipts on what's happening in Alabama. Today's episode titled, They Didn't Get These Lines Right, the ongoing fight for fair maps in Alabama. So let's dive into today's episode. So Kendra, why don't you tell everybody what's on tap for today?
Yeah, hey everyone. Well, as the title of the episode points out, we're still in the fight for fair maps in Alabama. As a result of the Supreme Court ruling on June the 8th in the Milligan case, the Alabama Legislature recently held a special session from July 17th to July the 21st to redraw Alabama's congressional maps to include a second majority black voting district. Today we'll take a look back at the 2023 special legislative session on redistricting and discuss what's next in the fight. And y'all, staying true to its nature, the supermajority in the legislature proved once again that they have no problem placing politics over people. So new maps were proposed, and despite pleas from the public and minority party legislators, the supermajority passed a map that further dilutes black voting power. And so y'all, today we're joined by Representative Chris England from House District 70, representing Tuscaloosa County, and who also served on the Reapportionment Committee, and Jess Unger, a senior staff attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And y'all, we're so happy to have y'all join us today.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both for joining us. Before we dive into this discussion, I want to take a moment to just catch folks up to where we are and how we got here. Now, over the past almost going on, let's say 2 years, it's been an ongoing battle trying to get the majority of the state legislature to put people over politics and draw congressional maps that provides an opportunity for Black voters in Alabama to have adequate representation, or in other words, to elect a candidate of their choice. So how do we get here? Okay. Here as in the Milligan case, because if we really took the time to dive into Alabama's history and unfair practices in its history of passing unfair policies and voter suppression, we'll be here a while, and we don't have time for that, but we will dive into that during the next episode. Now, okay, back to how do we get here? Now, during the 2021 redistricting cycle, Alabama Legislature passed unfair racially gerrymandered maps on November 3rd in 2021 that ultimately packed Alabama's Black voters into one congressional district, District 7, and then they sprinkled the rest of the Black voters across the remaining 6 districts, ultimately diluting the voting power of Black voters in our state. And when this happened, I'm going to be honest, I was livid, because it's not enough to have the right to vote, but my vote needs to carry the same power as the person across town. And it's just ridiculous that, that we're still fighting the same fight, right? That we've been fighting for decades. And I'm glad that I was not the only one that felt that way, because shortly after the maps passed, like literally 2 weeks later, to be exact, a group of Alabamians joined together to sue the state, which became known as the Milligan Case. Now, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And in October, the Supreme Court handed down, we heard the oral arguments, and then the Supreme Court handed down in June of 2023 a ruling that said that the state must redraw its congressional lines to create 2 majority-minority districts. And then the reapportionment process kicked off with the first public hearing being held on June 27th. Now, all I can say is that I felt like I was time warped back to 2021 during the public hearings, with the amount of just total disregard for, that the majority party gave in ensuring that the process was fair and transparent this go around. The Alabama Reapportionment Committee passed the Community of Interest map on July 17th. To be debated on the House and Senate floor during the special session, which kicked off on July 17th. And on July 21st, the supermajority, they passed a map that not only defied the Supreme Court's ruling, but it further diluted the voting power of Black Alabamians. And I mean, tell me you don't care about the people without telling me you don't care about the people, right, Kendra?
Oh, okay, yeah, Nisha, those are my thoughts exactly. And so Representative England, so you've been on the front lines of this fight in the legislature the whole time, and you've had to take steps such as providing maps on Twitter just to make sure the public had access to these maps and to increase public transparency. And the special session was very contentious, and we all saw that it lacked transparency. Despite a large turnout at 2 public hearings for the reapportionment committee, Alabama citizens repeatedly pled with the reapportionment committee, and even members of the minority party who were on the committee asked for answers and to be part of the process, and they were simply met with really no answers and not being included in the process. So, Representative England, we saw both you and Senator Figures, as well as the other minority party legislators on the reapportionment committee, constantly trying to find out more information about the potential map. And then you had the community of interest map, which was presented as a neutral option, which turned out to be Representative Pringle's map. And so that was a clear reflection of the glaring lack of transparency y'all encountered. So can you kind of give our listeners a firsthand account of what it's like navigating this redistricting process from inside the State House, and then your perspective on the committee's transparency, both from your own members and the general public?
Sure. So I share a lot of the same feelings that you both have. I guess there's a trend that developed from the 2021 maps where COVID delayed the census, which then delayed the numbers, which then delayed our process. So during that time, the supermajority used sort of the same approach. We were showing up to redistricting committee meetings and getting a boatload of information and then telling us that by the end of a meeting, we're going to have to vote on these things. In much the same way that many people went to Twitter to get the maps from me tweeting and then from the media, same thing happened in 2021. Many people saw the maps for the first time when I tweeted them, which is just insane to me. And interestingly enough, there were people from all across the nation, sliding into my DMs asking me, where did you get those from? And like, are they accurate? I'm like, dude, I'm on the committee. So
yeah.
This is like from them to you through me. So some of the same people during this process reached out to me and said, do you have the maps? And I was like, of course. So I was sending shape. So when you saw people coming up with analysis really quick about the numbers and how the districts were going to perform, I was sending people shape files so they could, take them, digest them, and put information out there that I quite frankly wasn't capable of doing myself. So, and it did. It kind of shed a new light on the process then, and it certainly shed a new light on the process now. And the way we do social media and share information, we can turn over information and provide that sort of data in real time now. So I was sending this information to different individuals, including people like Corrine Credden at the Brennan Center, who would turn around immediately and provide analysis and performance data on districts, even before the Republicans were willing to do so. And interesting thing about that committee meeting, everybody else was given a deadline. It said you had to have your maps in by a certain day. We're going to have 2 public hearings, and then if you go back and look at the original schedule, that meeting that occurred on the first day of the special session wasn't even scheduled. And it's because they realized they didn't schedule a meeting to actually adopt the map. So when we went to the second public hearing, if you remember, they said, we're going to have another meeting on Monday, and we're going to come back and adopt the map. Now, the interesting thing about that meeting, though, was Representative Hall introduced an amendment to our guidelines, and that's going to become relevant at a later point in the special session. But at that point, we did it because part of those amendments were to require just basic compliance with the Voting Rights Act, and ultimately voted down on party lines, racial lines. But it's just the greatest example of racially polarized voting you can see, even on the committee. So they voted those things down, and then they handed us an agenda for that meeting on that Monday, the first day of the special session. And the first map on the agenda was the opportunity map. Now, if you go back and look at the video from that meeting, and I've done it several times now because I wanted to make sure I was accurately portray what happened. There were a couple of senators who spoke up for the map, but when I asked Representative Pringle, one of the co-chairs where the map came from, he said, I think it came from the internet.
Mhm.
Senator Livingston was very conspicuously silent the entire time.
Mhm.
But anyway, as we work our way through the agenda, we skipped several maps because, Representative Pringle kept saying over and over again, I don't know where this came from. They came from the internet, blah, blah, blah. And we kept asking, how did you choose these maps? They didn't know, had no idea. We just decided which ones showed different aspects of the redistricting, so we picked them. Well, anyway, when we get to the communities of interest map, which is allegedly the compromise map, the one that the Republicans came up with to satisfy the court order, Voting Rights Act, and so forth, I asked Representative Pringle and Senator Singleton did, and Representative Jones all asked him, so is this your map? He said, yes, it is. Then he also said that this is going to be the map that I introduced in the House, and Senator Livingston was going to introduce in the Senate. This was our map. So the map had been vetted. For the first time, the public had actually gotten a look at it. We found out that the percentages are off. I mean, the Black voting age population in the 7th Congressional District was reduced. The Black voting age population in the 2nd Congressional District, which was their so-called Opportunity District, was 42%. But I'm not a math major, but that doesn't sound quite close to 50% to me. But
no, math ain't math.
That's just part of the narrative. The very next day, when we go into the House and to the Senate, the first map on that agenda, the opportunity map, was the one that Senator Livingston introduced in the Senate. Meanwhile, Pringle introduced the communities of interest map in the House. So we already had a significant difference of opinion in what was going to go on. And it was very clear from that beginning that Pringle and his crew had a different plan than the Senate. Senator Livingston, and we later found out National Republican. So the opportunity map dropped the BVAP in the 7th Congressional District even further to barely over 50%. And in the Opportunity District, as they called it, dropped it to like 38%. So we had two really non-compliant maps. But at that point, for me and many others, it cleared our perspective of what was actually going on. Because at that point, it became really easy to kind of see through what was going on. And ultimately, the plan was, we're going to take the arguments that were already rejected by the Supreme Court, including what communities of interest are, which ones actually are the most important ones versus the ones that they find to be most important, and also what the percentages should be. So as we worked our way through the session, the maps got worse, because they doubled down on a failed strategy to make sure that they forced this thing to the district court to try to get it back to the Supreme Court. And as Speaker Ledbetter said on the very last day, on his very last interview, maybe give something to Kavanaugh to look at again. So for me, it was like, for this entire week, the plan was to be as non-transparent as possible, to give the public less of an opportunity to digest what the actual plans were and what their ultimate plan was or is. And then also to do it in a way that was confrontational, meaning like we're not going to give you an opportunity at the district court level to give you anything to work with. Because like at the very least, if you read the Supreme Court's opinion, they made an argument about Mobile being a community of interest for them and how important the Gulf Coast area was, right? And the Supreme Court essentially said, and district court essentially said, we understand for the purposes of complying with the Voting Rights Act, the northern Mobile County Pritchard area has more in common with the Black Belt than it does with Baldwin County. And I think anybody acknowledges that. That's just basic common sense. Throughout history, from the early 90s up until now, the 7th Congressional District was actually created by a court, where the Black Belt was encompassed in the 7th Congressional District for the intended purpose of electing an African American or a candidate of choice for African Americans in Alabama. So those lines had already been blessed by the court for years. Then our Republican colleagues, and I'll shut up because I know I'm taking too much time.
No, this is good. You're giving receipts, and I appreciate them. So go ahead.
But at that point, the Republican colleagues decided that despite all the other evidence that indicates that this was just an argument of convenience at this point, decided that Mobile and Baldwin needed to stay together, even though in our House and our Senate maps, they don't care. Matter of fact, Senator Figures represents a part of Pritchard and Baldwin County for some reason. And then also, if you look at the state school board map, it's the exact same. They split the northern part of Mobile County and put it in a black belt district for the purposes of the state school board and for our state House and Senate maps, but all of a sudden for congressional purposes and for convenience sake, and to also basically say, we're going to defy the Supreme Court. We're going to fight this and make this a community of interest and make it the most important. And when I mentioned earlier, we tried to amend the rules or the guidelines. The reason we tried to do that was to get on record that there was no effort to comply. And that was confirmed when they not only passed the map, but they also attached legislative findings to the map that changed the rules of the committee at the point where we're at the end of the session. So the only people who could create a map that complied with the new guidelines was them. And it was actually the map that they passed that fit into the newly created guidelines that no one else was given an opportunity to satisfy. The map reiterates losing arguments. It justifies a position that the Supreme Court has already rejected, and then creates black voting age, put two congressional districts for the black voting age population. It's barely over 50% in the old 7th congressional district and 39% in the 2nd congressional district. And again, it's just an affront to the Supreme Court's directive, and I think it was a pretty stupid strategy.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I want to thank you for that detailed walkthrough. And also, I just want to thank you for the way that you have been representing the people, or that you represent the people, not just through debating on the floor, or supporting or putting forth bills that are reflective of solutions to issues that are really impacting people's front door. I am particularly thanking you and just shouting you out for the ways that you represent the people by making sure they have access to information about what's happening on Alabama's political scene. Because, as a media advocacy organization, Alabama Values Progress, we believe that knowledge is power. And one way to keep a group disempowered is to create barriers to information. Yeah. And we must all do the work to ensure that folks impacted by these unfair practices and policies are informed, they are engaged on how, when, and where to tap in. And that takes all of us, right? And history has shown us that every major shift in our nation's history, every momentous, change has come from the strength and the will of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. If we look at the civil rights movement from the 60s to the grass movements of today, our democracy has been and always will be fortified by the people. So thank you for being that.
Well, but for me, and I appreciate that, but Alabama practices the mushroom theory, which is keep people in the dark, feed them crap, and then watch them grow. In order to defeat that whole thing, that misinformation, that vacuum that's been created, the only way to do that is to do whatever is in my power to provide the information that I get my hands on. And honestly, none of it's supposed to be a secret. A couple of times in meetings, they, to put it diplomatically, express their frustration with the person on the committee that keeps tweeting out our maps. It made it a little bit more difficult for them because, like, for example, they only provided as performance data for that 2nd congressional district that they created 4 elections. One of them was the Doug Jones election. And Doug Jones managed to win in that hypothetical district by a very large, I won't even say a very large margin, 20,000 votes, but he had to run against an alleged child predator who was, the Republican Party overall was depressing their own vote in favor of him. Their idea of opportunity is putting a Democrat up against an extremely flawed candidate. But we were able to actually go back to 16 to 20 different elections to show that the only election that was won was that one, Doug Jones. And that's not representative of opportunity, in my opinion. And if you look at the map, it just, as I said on the House floor, it basically creates opportunities for a bunch of Republicans.
Ooh, y'all, I see no lies there at all.
Period. Yeah.
But y'all, unfortunately, we have seen that it's very, very clear that the Alabama supermajority legislature refused to draw equitable maps, and the only way we're going to get fair maps is through the courts. So we saw the supermajority, they just straight up blatantly disregarded the court's order and passed a new map that's effectively worse than the ones that the court tossed out. So what I want to do now is dive into the legal aspects of all this that took place. So Jess, as a voting rights lawyer, how do you see the legal implications of the recent decisions, and what can you tell us about the process and how this map violates the Voting Rights Act?
Thank you so much, Kendra, for the question. Thank you both for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone. And I have to say, I agree with Representative England's characterization of the process. This is a situation where the legislature simply did not take seriously the district court order, even after it was upheld by the Supreme Court this summer. And we have the consequences of that now in the legislative record and in the public record. We have seen step by step a series of public hearings where public voices were more or less ignored by the committee, and there is no correlation between public input about what the maps ought to look like and the legislative output that we got to see. We have a legislative record that shows over and over again that steps were rushed or skipped in consideration of these maps. Their fusion was messy. Even the legislative findings, which Representative England just mentioned, have typos in it. And they say weird things like that this part is the non-negotiable part of our findings. I've never seen that in legislative findings for any bill or redistricting instructions for any redistricting process before. What this means, in my view, is that we have a legislative output in this new 2023 map, which does not bear much in the way of relation to what the court has asked for in a remedy. The district court found a likely violation of the Voting Rights Act and said that a remedy must include 2 districts in which Black voters comprise a voting age majority or something quite close to it. We don't have that. We've discussed that. And even now that plaintiffs on the docket, and Southern Poverty Law Center does not represent plaintiffs, I should say that, but the plaintiffs on the docket have objected to this map as a remedy in litigation. The state continues to try to find ways to wriggle out of this remedial process. They've fought ceaselessly this summer to try to reset what the standard is for assessing the remedy. They have very recently gone back and forth about what all is going to be discussed in the next hearing in this litigation. And I think that we're likely to see continued resistance to the standard that they will eventually have to meet for a remedy here.
So you pointed out something, Jess. So we've been talking about the new congressional maps, but I think it's important for folks to know that the maps passed through the as the map passed through the legislature, it was passed as a bill. So this map passed as Senate Bill 5 or SB 5, right? But the bill, as you mentioned, it just didn't include the maps, right? It included some extra things and opinions thrown in. And now we know that the legislative findings are, non-binding, but it's still important to talk about it. So what was added, right? Let's talk about it. SB 5 states that the congressional districting plan shouldn't split more than 6 counties and should impair incumbent members of Congress within the same district, and that these principles are non-negotiable for the legislator. That's what you were pointing to, just right. But this is the part that got me. There was another legislative finding that really jumped out about communities of interest. And I think Representative England, you were alluding to this part where it talked about a community of interest is a defined area of the state that may be characterized by, among other commonalities, shared economic interests, geographic features, transportation infrastructure. Y'all, this is the one that got me right here. Broadcast and print media, educational institutions, and historical or cultural factors. I mean, tell me you're trying to skew down in the direction of your argument without, but I did want to ask, since the legislative findings are non-binding, Representative England, what do you think the point of adding these, what was the point of adding these provisions? Like, what message do you think the legislators are trying to send?
Oh, it's crystal clear. So legislative findings rewrote the guidelines. And at its core, legislative findings were to reiterate to the court the explanation as to why the Gulf Coast is a community of interest. And if you maintain the Gulf Coast as a community of interest, that means you provide a justification for further cracking the population of the Black Belt and splitting it and diluting it. Non-negotiable 6-county splits, so forth, those were the guidelines that they set for themselves, and then they created a map to match those guidelines. And again, if you listen to Speaker Ledbetter, when he said that we're going to give possibly a justice something else to look at, you've got to go back and read what Kavanaugh said and what some of the meaning of it is. Because again, complying with the Voting Rights Act is complying with federal law. Mm-hmm. It is a compelling state interest that allows you to split counties, to deviate, to split precincts, because the goal of the Voting Rights Act is to create an opportunity for Black folks in Alabama or across the country, the majority, minority, to elect a candidate of choice. They took into account racially polarized voting in Alabama. I think it was 98% or 96% for white folks, 92% for Black folks. So when you look at that, you can't come to any other conclusion that in order for Black folks to elect a candidate of choice, the district's got to be a majority minority, right? Mm-hmm. So in order for Alabama to push back on that assertion, you've got to establish non-negotiable guidelines that say these are more important to us. So when we create our communities of interest, and any map going forward has to comply with these guidelines. And what they hope is Kavanaugh says, oh, okay. Or we'll say the Supreme Court says, oh, okay, well, the other maps don't comply with those guidelines. And also, if they don't comply with those guidelines, we can still comply with federal law, but also state redistricting principles and get away with further diluting the 7th or the 2nd congressional district as far as Black voting power is concerned. So it was basically an avenue or an opportunity as they forced their way to the district court to get back to the Supreme Court for them to latch on to something else and say, oh, okay, well, here's Alabama's argument. And they appear to have complied with their own regulations, the Voting Rights Act, and satisfy the court order, and hopefully get away with undermining Section 2. But there's a broader issue here too. I want you, Speaker McCarthy called Senator Livingston and said, I want to keep my majority. The majority is razor thin anyway. So even if they ultimately fail at the Supreme Court level, they want to drag this thing beyond this election cycle and try to force us to use this illegal map, which helps them maintain that razor thin majority. Because Alabama's case, the Milligan case, is the linchpin across the country. It created precedent that now lawsuits are popping up in different areas where you may manufacture through voting rights litigation additional districts that tend to vote Democrat. So if they can delay the ultimate disposition of this case beyond this election cycle, they have a better chance of protecting that majority. And that's despite the history of Alabama, that's despite the history of the country in terms of voting rights, and also disenfranchising people and making it difficult for Black folks to get elected positions. All of that's cast aside. We're all collateral damage for a political game that people are playing that don't even live here. So those legislative findings were once again an affront, basically telling you that regardless of what you said, regardless of what your directives are, we're going to do what we want to do. And hopefully you will change the rules. We're all Republicans, we're all conservatives here. Change the rules to accommodate us. Oh, and by the way, if you can get rid of Section 2 in the process, it's a win-win.
Oh my goodness. And on top of that, since passing these unfair maps, the second go around, we've seen a few legal analysis that came out, some seeking to rationalize the new maps. and some suggesting that the Alabama legislature should tread lightly because this could set, a new precedent for something. For example, in a recent article by the Alabama Reflector, they pointed out how the state of Alabama argued in its Friday filing of the new maps that drawing the two majority Black congressional districts to address the court's finding that the state's congressional maps violate the Voting Rights Act would be unconstitutional. And you're like, how, right? Well, they, in a 65-page brief, the Alabama Attorney General's office cited the U.S. Supreme Court's recent ruling striking down affirmative action, yes, folks, affirmative action programs at colleges and universities to argue that drawing two such districts would require drawing them on racial lines. And they're using the recent Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action. If reaching, again, was a person. And then we have Kareem Creighton, who's an expert on the intersection of law, politics, and race. He posted an interesting theory on Twitter regarding Section 3C of the Voting Rights Act, stating that Section 3C of the Voting Rights Act contains a provision known as pre-clearance bail-in, which gives the court the power to order equitable relief for a state that violates the 14th or 15th Amendment. For a time, the state would need the federal government to review or permission to change its voting rights laws. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like Section 5 that was overturned, in the Shelby v. Holder case. But Creighton, he explained that Section 3C is different, it's a different provision from the one SCOTUS struck down in 2013, just based on the formula, in that to invoke 3C, a court would need to find multiple intentional violations of these amendments. And, Representative England, you keep, referring to Alabama's history, right? And this provision is why Creighton says Alabama Republicans might, have poked a bear with this latest map and, them defying the courts. But just given your legal background, also, like, how would you evaluate the state's compliance with the SCOTUS ruling, and what do you anticipate, as the next steps in this ongoing battle for voting rights?
First of all, I have to say, I'm not the court. I'm just a lawyer with opinions, and I can't necessarily predict which way the district court or any reviewing court is going to go in this process. But I've had an opportunity to review the maps. We've got fabulous experts who've contributed to the conversation about these maps, and I think it's pretty clear for everyone to see that we have a district court order that calls for two districts with Black Alabamians comprising voting age majority or something quite close to it. We're nowhere near that in the map that passed. As Representative Ingham laid out pretty well, the legislative findings that accompany that map are retrofitted attorney arguments that lost in the most recent round of litigation and don't make any more sense now than they did before when they lost. And we're now heading through a remedial phase where the district court's job is to measure these maps and anything that else passed with them against the standard of, have we remedied the violation of the Voting Rights Act that we found? And I think there's a great argument on the plaintiff's side that these maps do not remedy the problem. So where do we go from there? There will be a court-ordered cartographer if the court agrees, who may begin drawing maps. There may be further appeals, but I want to, before we sort of go too far afield in the future, I do want to address the point that you raised about some concerns that there may be race discrimination or predominance, undue predominance of race as a consideration in the remedial phase following this finding that there's likely a Voting Rights Act violation. We've heard those arguments from time to time before. We even heard them in public comment, I know, from time to time. But the fact of the matter is that in order to remedy a Voting Rights Act violation, you must consider race to reconstitute a compliant map. That is an acceptable consideration of race in the map drawing process. It's been repeated by courts time and time again. And I don't expect that those arguments will succeed, at least under the current case law that we have. It does not make sense that you should be disallowed from considering race in remedying a Voting Rights Act violation. I just can't square that circle. On 3C, as a potential additional remedy, I know that the Milligan plaintiffs, in their original complaint way back in 2021, asked for exactly what you mentioned, 3C bail-in. And it is, I have to say, it is rare. We have not seen as much of it as we have seen Section 5 objections back in the day when Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was still in effect. You're right to point out that there are different standards and slightly different kinds of preclearance. 3C preclearance, exactly as you said, Anisha, it works where courts find multiple repeated intentional violations of voting rights, discriminatory violations of voting rights in a jurisdiction. In those instances where you have that finding, a court can order, I'm going to hold on to this one. I'm going to retain jurisdiction over this issue for a period of time and consult with you, state government or local government, whatever level of government we're at, as you make changes going forward. It's not totally dissimilar from preclearance as we used to know it. The most recent sort of instance that comes to mind that really made waves was a Florida district court ordered preclearance for 10 years under Section 3C after finding quite a few intentional violations in a case in Florida. That's currently on hold, and there's further proceedings that have moved forward there, but it's not unheard of. The standards are a little intense and they're evolving. There's only a few cases that give us guidance on how it applies. So I think that this is an area that we're going to see continued evolution. But I think that the seeds are there on this docket for this case here in Alabama that it's something that the court may be considering again as the case progresses. I hope that hit each piece.
No, it did. No, thank you for that.
Yeah, so thanks, Jess, so much for diving into Section 3C. It's definitely not something that we get to talk about a lot. So now, y'all, I want to pose a question for both of y'all. So we heard a lot in redistricting that it's an intensely political process, and some people think it's best carried out by politicians. And we've heard that during both the 2021 redistricting cycle and the 2023 special session. But in reality, almost none of the legislators, no matter what side of the aisle they were on, had anything to do with the actual process of drawing these maps. So I want to talk about an issue like across the nation. There's a growing number of states that are turning to independent redistricting commissions, aiming to take the politics out of the process and maybe empower the vote of the people a little bit more. So independent redistricting commissions are gaining traction as a potential solution to gerrymandering. So these commissions consist of a diverse group of citizens, often excluding elected officials or political insiders, and are tasked with drawing district lines without partisan bias. And some argue that the need to shift the power to draw maps from politicians to citizens, independent redistricting commissions aim to put the interests of communities and voters first. That's something we've been talking about, the need to put people over politics. So in 2021, I personally asked Dorman Walker, the reapportionment committee attorney, about this, and he told me that redistricting is inherently political, and he did not believe that you could take politics out of the redistricting process. So we'd love to hear y'all's take on independent redistricting commissions, especially given that the past two redistricting attempts and the lack of transparency by reapportionment leaders, and the fact that Alabamans' opinions were not considered. So do y'all think this would be something that would be helpful in Alabama?
It's a great question. I have to say that the Southern Poverty Law Center has a clear answer on this. And Anisha, earlier you mentioned the Shelby County decision and all the damage that it's brought on sort of the protections that we have in this country for voting rights, and the loss of Section 5 preclearance under the Voting Rights Act. Recently, Southern Poverty Law Center actually released a report on all the things that have happened to voters since that Shelby County decision, what we have learned about what a country is like when it doesn't have those protections. And if folks want to check it out, it's available on our website at splcenter.org. But we have some recommendations. It's not all doom and gloom. We have some recommendations for things that we might be able to build again or improve upon going forward in this world that we're living in now. And one of those things is independent redistricting commissions. In the center's view, it's really important for us to be able to have that. But it's worth bearing in mind that not all independent commissions are built alike. There are differences in the features and the instructions that they work under from state to state. And so we've learned a thing or two about what makes them work best. Having positions on the Independent Redistricting Commission for community members, having screening methods to assess sort of applicants to serve on the commission, whether they have conflicts or not, that's important. Making sure that written into the instructions for the commission are protections for communities of color and other minority groups within your community, also very important. And making sure that there are functions in the rules of the commission to solicit live community input throughout the process, so that you are getting live qualitative information from the people who live there about what real communities of interest are. They've been so important in this litigation on the Milligan docket. They're going to continue to be important in every redistricting cycle going forward. They're a foundational building block for drawing good maps that represent people. There's more to say. Our report has a little more on independent redistricting commissions as well, so please do check it out, but I'll leave it there just to keep the answer short.
Yes, and give us that website just for our listeners and for our viewers. We'll have it going across the screen. But what's that website?
I'm so glad you asked. It's splcenter.org.
Thank you. Now, y'all, this has been a long fight. And one of the things I realized is that we often talk about redistricting as this once in a decade process. Wait, hold on. Before I even go in that, Representative England, what are your thoughts on the independent redistricting commissions?
I do agree with Dorman Walker. It's a uniquely and intensely political process, and one of the main components of politics is the art of self-preservation, creative ways to make it happen. So, asking politicians to, and this is ironic but the truth, asking politicians to place power into citizens' hands that can't ultimately be manipulated or controlled to our benefit isn't likely going to happen very often. So if you see a majority, and this is bipartisan, any way to manipulate the forces of political power to make sure that the amount of the sphere of influence, the power you have, can somewhat be maintained in a centralized location like a state house, you're going to continue to see those efforts like independent redistricting commissions being thwarted in those areas. But for me, I believe that having things like that is what moderates the process. It keeps us away from the fringes. So these people that pay a lot of money to manipulate voters and then identify who votes and who doesn't, so they can craft their message to those specific people and then draw a district around it so they can continue to get reelected, creates the results like you see now, a legislature that's willing to defy the Supreme Court to make them bend to their will. So for me, I support things that would put those quality control mechanisms in place. Over the years, I've sponsored legislation to take money out of judicial races, create districts for our state Supreme Court, any sort of thing that creates some sort of check and balance on that process. So, as you know, this is cliche, but it's accurate that politicians don't choose, keep politicians from choosing their voters, and the voters are able to choose their politicians. So, that's a concept that I support. I just know here in Alabama, every effort towards transparency, actually involving, as you know, my colleagues also say, we the people all the time, but any process that actually engages and involves we the people, I invite that. But in this current climate, it's not often that you see it.
Yeah, no, good observation. And, as I was saying, like this has been a long fight. It's an ongoing fight. And, we even use language about redistricting being this once in a decade process that people need to tap in, right? But it's really a year-round process. This is probably one of the most important processes. Redistricting is connected to every issue, just about every issue that we advocate for year-round: healthcare, education, criminal justice, voting rights. It is how we, the people, ensure that we have adequate representation and that our voices are heard. But it's important to note that this fight takes place in like various rings, right? And in the court of public opinion, like in public discourse, and in the state house, and in the courtrooms, and as legislators, organizers, policy folks, and just everyday, citizens. It's important that, that we have a very engaged and active, electorate. So what would you all say? How can everyone get involved and stay tapped in, Representative England, like with their legislators and just, with organizations that are, on the ground, working around these issues? What are some advice that you can give to people who are like, hey, I'm tuned in now and I want to stay engaged and stay a part and be a part of the change that I want to see?
I think you saw a lot of that in our redistricting process. You've got to hold your elected official accountable by showing up. And whether you believe it or not, the fact that those rooms were packed in this redistricting process is part of the record that's going to be shown to the Supreme Court, to the district court, to the plaintiffs and the defendants about how many people were actually ignored in the process. And, if we allow the politicians and elected officials or whatever to operate behind closed doors, don't vote, don't participate, then you really don't have any business complaining about what the outcome is. And, when I go talk to kids and groups about the power or the necessity of voting, I'll generally try to break the room up into like 100 people, right? And I'll take the last election cycle and I'll say, so let's imagine that 35% of the people voted in this last election. So there are 100 people in this room, but only 35 of the people voted, and they made decisions for all 100. Now, you can look at that group of 35. Let's put in your mind a group of 35 people, and you might say some of those people are flat out idiots. They shouldn't even have the power to make any choices, much less choose elected officials. But when you don't vote, you empower those same people that you don't have any confidence to make decisions about your community. So that's the message. It's like the point. Like if you want to make decisions, you want to be involved, you want to have a seat at the table, the basic bare minimum is voting. The basic bare minimum is attending. The basic bare minimum is voicing your opinion and having some impact on policy. Because I tell you, the easiest answer for a politician is for them to say, I didn't hear from you. And then you're ignored. So I would encourage, just as you saw in this redistricting process, and as you've seen it throughout the years, whether it be things about women's reproductive rights or health insurance or education and those things, the more attention you pay, the more ferocious your advocacy is, the more likely you are to have some impact on the outcome. But I can guarantee you won't change anything at all if you don't do anything at all.
Great point. Yes?
Amen. I can't agree more that voting is an absolutely vital civic muscle. It is a beginning, not an end, but it is so important. Folks who are listening to this podcast, wherever you are, if you're on a smartphone or near a computer, one thing you can do to make sure that you are able to vote is check your registration status. Make sure that your address is accurate in your registration record. It's easy to do. In many states, it takes fewer than 5 minutes, sometimes just one. It's worth doing to make sure you don't have hassles going in to vote in the next election. Can't recommend that enough. As for following the center, I direct folks once more to sblcenter.org. It's pretty easy to sign up for updates there, and there's a real wealth of resources on the site, reports, news, really rich editorial pieces to follow. And the last thing I'll say, if you want to stay involved in Alabama, there's no better place to follow than Alabama Values. I assume everyone hearing this is already hooked up to the good stuff, but if not, go to Alabama Values and get signed up.
Yes, awesome.
And I want to say though, as individuals who are part of marginalized communities, those who've had a front seat of history over the course of Alabama's complex development and racial racial politics, right?
Mhm.
There are generation after generation after generation of Black people and other marginalized communities that have witnessed Alabama's affront to the federal court system and the federal government over its entire decade.
Mhm.
There are many people now who are just coming into their own and looking at Alabama politics who have had the same experience as individuals who were trying to integrate schools years ago, where the federal government told Alabama they had to integrate schools, and instead of doing that, they stood in the schoolhouse door. So as perspective grows, and as people begin to witness the history repeating itself in different ways, I can't think of anything more motivating than to have a front seat at that history and create a perspective that motivates you to continue to fight those things. And for me, and it's obvious, everybody comes into these situations with their own perspective. I've been involved in politics since a child. My dad was a politician. He ran for office. He was actually on the Supreme Court of the state of Alabama for a couple of years. And, one of the things that brings this whole court case home to me, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling, but this is the perspective that I think is motivating for people, should be motivating for people, is when my dad ran for re-election in I think 2002, they told him in creating a strategy for a statewide election that he didn't need to put his pictures in his ads, because they felt like if they realized he was Black, the likelihood would be that he would not win. It would impact his election results. And that was in 2002. So 20 years later, or 21 years later, after the Supreme Court takes on a long record of racially polarized voting that has made it so only three Black people in Alabama's history have been able to serve on its highest court. No other Black people have been able to serve in a statewide elected office. It comes full circle when just a very basic argument about representation comes up, where 27% of the population isn't adequately represented in Congress, and instead of embracing the opportunity to create space, we reject it. And not only reject it, but do it in the same way that we've done forever. So many Black people, old and now those who are growing in perspective, watching Alabama do it again, have a very unique common feeling of the same thing that all of us have felt at one point or another. So, and it's not just Black people, it's women, it's members of the LGBTQ community, it's all marginalized communities that know that Alabama may be ignoring and fighting a court order for voting rights here, but it was marriage equality not too long ago. It was a woman's right to choose not too long ago. It's the ability to go to a school that values your presence instead of trying to discourage being taught about your history. So Alabama always ends up in the same place. So with that in mind, to me, it should be a motivating force for you to do as much as possible so history stops repeating itself in the state over and over again, and marginalized people continue to suffer.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us and offering your insight into the special session on redistricting and what's next in the process, and also your encouragement for folks to get involved and stay involved in the fight for voting rights, fair maps, and adequate representation.
Yes, wait. But before we go, y'all got to get on the soapbox. It's new this season. So the soapbox is the place where, you get a chance to rant for 60 seconds. Feel free to tear a hole in whoever or whatever, but keep it clean because the kids are watching, as they should be. This is good information. But let's see, who wants to volunteer to go first?
I'll get it out of the way real quick.
It's like someone was voluntold. Okay, so Kevin, you're gonna get put on the soapbox. You'll know because you'll be on the screen. So let's go.
I just want to make sure that people understand what's at stake here, and I want you to be disgusted. I want you to be disappointed, but I don't want you to be discouraged. There will always be barriers put up between you and power, especially if you're a part of a marginalized community. But the worst thing you can do in a situation like that is concede, because it won't get better, it'll just get worse. So I just want to make sure that people continue to pay attention to what's going on, continue to fight, and continue to do the very basics of representation of your citizenship, which is vote. And then from there, grow, participate, potentially run for office, help us create policy, and so forth and so on. So my soapbox is I want people to be disgusted. I want them to be disappointed, but I don't want them to be discouraged. And I want people to continue fighting. Basically concede Alabama to becoming the place that we don't want it to be.
I love that. And you're going to look up, and that's going to be a whole campaign. Be disgusted, but don't concede. Y'all better tell them. I'll remix something real quick.
Put it on a t-shirt.
Yes, it's gonna be a campaign. Okay, y'all heard it here first. All right, so Jess, you ready to get on the box?
Absolutely. I'm a lawyer. I have no poetry. You just heard some very beautiful poetry. I have a very simple pitch. We don't have enough poll workers in this country, and it makes me mad every time that I go to my own polling place as a voter or serve myself as a poll worker in my community. Every polling place I've ever been in has been understaffed, and it is easy. It's 1 day, maybe a 2-day commitment. Every poll worker is paid. Please consider this November, whenever the next election is in your community, signing up. I guarantee that your county or state government makes it easy to sign up to be a poll worker. Try it once, you'll get hooked. We need more poll workers. You can be one.
Look, that was just as poetic. I feel you. Like, poll workers are important. Look. So look, okay, y'all, you may be wondering, how can you stay connected, get involved, and stay informed around, this ongoing fight, right? Definitely tune in to future A Different Frame episodes. The podcast is streaming on all platforms, and you can catch the video version, aka the podcast, on all social media platforms and YouTube at Alabama Values Progress, or our website at www.alabamavaluesprogress.org. So like, follow, subscribe, and share to stay connected and get the latest news and updates regarding issues in Alabama, and connect with our partner organizations that are on the ground working to build an equitable, sustainable Alabama. And that's all for today's episode. They didn't get these lines right. Unfair maps in Alabama's political puzzle. Join us for next week's episode, Spare Me the Eraser, another attempt to whitewash Black history, where we will discuss the ongoing banning of books, literature, and educational discussions regarding Black history, race, and other applicable topics. This is going to be a different episode. We'll have a special co-host. Kendra, you will be missed, but I know you will be watching. So we'll be joined by a special co-host and some other guests, and you don't want to miss this episode. All right, till next time.